Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Carlson. I'm an associate professor in the government department, the director of Cornell's China Asia Pacific Studies program, or CAPS, and also the current holder of the Michael J. Zach Chair. I wanted to start this afternoon by giving special thanks to the East Asia program, especially Amala Lane, who's been an expert at making all of this happen this fall. And also the CAPS program and its donors, Mike Zach and Brittany and Adam Levinson, because this series has really been quite a remarkable set of discussions with great turnout from the Cornell community and abroad. And it wouldn't have happened without EAP and CAPS. The series itself is entitled, What is China? And it hinges on the concept that answering the question, what is China, entails asking other somewhat more complex questions, such as what happens when we decouple China from the People's Republic of China? Are there sort of silences which open up? Are there new spaces for discussion and consideration of what China and the areas around it constitute, both in terms of territoriality and in terms of collective identity? And also what practices are employed by states and people to give meaning to the construct of, and I'm going to use air quotes here, Shelley, China, and to determine who belongs within its borders and who is outside of its territory. Many of you have already attended the previous 3 lectures in this series, the first by Barbara Demnick, the second by James Millward, and the third by C.K. Lee. And really what we saw in those talks was that answering the question, what is China, perhaps and maybe necessarily entails also answering the question, what is not China? Today, the last speaker of our series will be Shelley Rigger of Davidson College. Professor Rigger is the Brown Professor of East Asian Politics at Davidson. She has a PhD in government from Harvard and a BA from Princeton. She's been a visiting researcher at National Zhengzhou University in Taiwan and a visiting professor at Fudan in Shanghai as well. She's the author of multiple books on Taiwan, domestic politics, including Why Taiwan Matters, which John Oliver, in a segment which was not safe for work, flashed on the screen very briefly a week or 2 ago. And I said, oh, I know that person. So that made me kind of happy. I said it to my sons too, and they're like, yeah, whatever. But in addition to that book, she's written the books Politics in Taiwan, Voting for Democracy, and From Opposition to Power, Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party. Most recently, she also has just come out with The Tiger Leading the Dragon, which looks, I think, kind of flips some of the questions which we've asked in this series on its head. Shelley has been doing research in Taiwan since the early 90s. And it really is a leading student of Taiwanese politics here in America. Frankly, it'd probably be better to be at this virtual summit meeting today between the president and Xi Jinping than speaking with us, but we're thrilled to have you. As of today, as has been the case with previous talks, Professor Rigger will speak for about 45 minutes, to be followed by Q&A. If you have questions during the course of the talk, please put them in the chat box. I'll be collecting these over the course of her lecture and pull from this virtual queue to start our Q&A period. In addition, there will be time for live questions from you all for the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time together. And for that, just use the raise hand function so that we can keep a list of who's asking questions. We're using this format to promote the open exchange of views and to help moderate conversation in a manner that will hopefully lead to productive and enriching discussion of the issues consistent with Cornell's core values. The title of Professor Rigger's talk today is China part of Taiwan? ? Shelley, welcome, albeit virtually, to Cornell.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And I wish I really was able to be with you. My husband is a Cornell alum. And one of the things he holds against me is that I have never actually found a way to get him back to Cornell so he could show me around. So we'll keep trying. One of these days it will work. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Does that look good? How about that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So when I am speaking in public anywhere, I try never to use the word China without some kind of a modifier on it, especially if Taiwan is anywhere near the conversation. But even if Taiwan is not anywhere near the conversation, I try to use a modifier with the word China all the time, because I don't think that the word China without a modifier makes a whole lot of sense in general, but it definitely doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Taiwan. So in preparing for today, I brainstormed a lot of the modifiers that I could think of that attach themselves to China in my work or in conversations that we have. Lots and lots and lots of ways to imagine China, none of which many of which are meaningful for Taiwan, but none of which is meaningful without its modifier. So the earliest China is no China for Taiwan. Prior to about the 16th century, Taiwan was an island inhabited by people who had no ancestral connection to mainland China. So that's my first modifier, mainland China at all. So the indigenous or Aboriginal peoples of Taiwan. But during the Ming era, this is a Ming era map, there began to be a connection between Taiwan and the mainland. And people who thought of themselves in some way as participants in the human community on mainland China, which was governed more or less by a series of dynastic regimes, which understood themselves at the time in some cases and are understood today in all cases as somehow meaningfully representing China. Yeah, the Ming was one of those. And for most people in Taiwan, the Ming was a very distant reality, a very a place that they had left, usually because they wanted to get away, usually for economic reasons, but sometimes for other reasons. And so the Ming was in many ways unwelcome in Taiwan, or Ming officials at least were unwelcome in Taiwan. But toward the end of the Ming era, the most powerful individuals and organizations in Taiwan attached themselves to the Ming and in fact began to resist the coming of the next leadership, the Qing China, on the grounds that it was not a legitimate successor to the Ming and should be resisted. And in fact, for a while, the Taiwan forces on Taiwan were trying to overthrow the Qing and replace it with the old Ming ruling house. So the next China that comes to Taiwan is Manchu China or Qing China. And I say Manchu China because for those on Taiwan who were active in the resistance against the Qing, the issue with the Qing was precisely that it was not Chinese enough, or that it was not Chinese at all, and that it lacked legitimacy because the Manchus were not real Chinese. So after the Manchu invaders eventually defeated the Ming remnant in Taiwan and established themselves in the mainland and also extended their authority to greater and lesser extents over time in Taiwan, they became the embodiment of authority on the island. And again, there was perpetual kind of resentment and resistance. Qing officials who were posted to Taiwan did not have an easy time because it was a pretty rugged and feisty population on the island. So even Qing China did not have an easy time governing Taiwan. The next China that appears in on the sort of fringes of Taiwan's experience is modern China. This is Sun Yat-sen being just after being elected president of the Republic of China. But modern China really begins the consolidation of the modern Chinese nation state begins in the late 1800s with the reforms, the efforts by the Qing dynasty to reform itself and pressures on it from various reformers, and continues through the early part of the 20th century, and then eventually achieves a kind of marginal consolidation with the overthrow of the Qing in 1911 and the establishment of the Republic of China. So one of the features of modern China certainly is another modified China, that is the Republic of China. So I emphasize this period from beginning in around 1895 and extending into the first few decades of the 20th century as formative for modern China, for the nation state China on the mainland. And I emphasize it because the formative events of this period, this series of really wrenching, inspiring, violent, terrifying, but ultimately formative experiences that were taking place on the mainland and that were forging the idea and the reality of modern China were not happening in Taiwan. So on Taiwan, the China from 1895 through the early decades of the 20th century was ancestral China, cultural China, the memory of our origins in mainland China, but it was not the everyday reality of Taiwanese people that they were living in or participating in a Chinese state, because from 1895 to 1945, Taiwan was part of the Empire of Japan. So if you look at this map, this is a map of the Republic of China, and you see that the provinces of the ROC are colored in blue, green, pink, and yellow, but the territories outside the Republic of China are not colored, they're white. And Taiwan is, you can see, part of Japan. The words Japan spread from the Japanese mainland down toward Taiwan, because Taiwan was part of the Japanese Empire in this period because of having been turned over by Qing China, Manchu China, to the Empire of Japan at the end of the Sino-Japanese War with the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. So here is a Japanese woodcut of imagining what the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki must have looked like. So during those decades when the ideas and the power, the passion of modern China was being forged on the mainland, Taiwanese were living under the Japanese flag. And here is the world's skinniest sumo team, because this is a Taiwanese sumo club from the colonial period. So I just want to pause for a second and make it clear that, whatever the PRC has rightly, I think, complained that the Treaty of Shimonoseki was an unequal treaty, an unfair treaty, that the severance of Taiwan from the Qing China and from the Republic of China was illegal. But the reality, the lived reality for Taiwanese people was that the Qing had released them and they had become part of Japan. And by the 1940s, which is, we're talking about 50 years, we're talking about a human lifetime in the late 19th century in Northeast Asia. Many Taiwanese had become, not entirely, assimilated to the Japanese Empire, but assimilated enough to take Japanese names and to fight for the Japanese military in World War II. So while many Taiwanese families continued to honor the traditions of ancestral China, right? They maintained their family altars. And to this very day, lots of Taiwanese families can tell you where their ancestors came from in Fujian back in the 1600s or 1700s. And they gave the elite families in Taiwan also tried to give their children something like a Confucian education at the same time they were receiving a Japanese education in state schools. They were not Chinese by nationality until 1945, when the fall of the Japanese Empire placed Taiwan through a series of events that we can discuss in detail later if anyone's interested, but I don't want to belabor too long right now, placed Taiwan under the flag of the Republic of China, which was at that time ruling mainland China as well as Taiwan. So when the ROC came to Taiwan on both sides, from the perspective of the Taiwanese and from the perspective of those coming from the mainlanders, whom I am going to refer to as 49ers. So these are people who came to Taiwan between 1945 and 1949 from the mainland. Neither side really saw this as the kind of comfortable restoration of Taiwanese into the bosom of their motherland or their fatherland. The 49ers recognized that Taiwanese had been living under the enemy for 50 years and that many of them had been recently on the battlefields, not of China, but of other fronts in the Pacific War, where China's allies, where the ROC's allies had been fighting these Taiwanese. And there was just a great deal of suspicion on the 49ers' part toward the Taiwanese. Many Taiwanese were relieved to be returned to ancestral China, but they were quickly shocked to learn that the Republic of China was not the ancestral China that of their imagination, but was rather an authoritarian regime capable of significant violence when necessary to suppress Taiwanese resistance. So between 1945 and 1949, as I'm sure many of you know, there was a major confrontation, a violent episode in 1947 where Taiwanese discovered just how ferocious the ROC military could be in ensuring its continued control over the island of Taiwan. So after 1949, when the People's Republic came into being in mainland China, so the People's Republic of China becomes the China in mainland China, then the Republic of China establishes itself on Taiwan and makes the claim that it was the legitimate state for all of China. So the existence of two claimants to the status of the Chinese state began in 1949. From the perspective of the vast majority of the population of Taiwan, those who had been there prior to 1945, this was a complicated and genuinely complicated event. So for the next 40 years or so after 1949, most Taiwanese, 49ers and Taiwanese alike, saw themselves as citizens of the Republic of China. They understood the Republic of China to be the state that was governing the island of Taiwan. And yet for the Taiwanese, they did not experience their life or their status as being fully Chinese. Because the definition of what it meant to be Chinese that the ROC brought to Taiwan did not fully embrace the lived experience of Taiwanese people. So, for example, Taiwanese people spoke the Minnan dialect, or Hokkien, which is a dialect from, or a language from the Fujian area on the Chinese mainland across the Taiwan Strait. And I think they imagined that this was a Chinese language, that in contradistinction to Japanese, it was definitely Chinese, but it wasn't Chinese as far as Chiang Kai-shek and the 49ers were concerned. In their view, proper Chinese was Mandarin, and Taiwanese people needed to learn to speak Mandarin in order to be fully Chinese. So from the very beginning, the policies, and I can talk about many different policies that the ROC, the Republic of China, used to govern Taiwan as a part of a larger China, which existed in their imagination and ambition, if not in reality, those policies from the very beginning alienated Taiwanese from the idea of themselves as fully Chinese people. But for those first 40 years or so, a little bit more than 40 years, Taiwanese were really focused on what I would call internal China, or the China that existed inside Taiwan, and that is the Republic of China. The Republic of China was multifaceted. Many Taiwanese made their peace with it and embraced it and became active in the ROC state. So I am not suggesting that everyone in Taiwan, even all Taiwanese from before 1945, were dissatisfied or in resistance to the ROC, but there was a significant sentiment within Taiwan that the ROC was not fully aligned with the interests and identities of Taiwanese people. For one thing, the mainland, the 49ers had a lot of privilege in the society. They were they were first-class citizens, and Taiwanese were second-class citizens. And again, I can talk about specifically examples of how not only Taiwanese cultural practices or ways of living were discriminated against, but also how Taiwanese as human beings experienced discrimination under the ROC regime. Another characteristic of the ROC on Taiwan was the domination of the political system by the Kuomintang, the KMT, as a political party, so that Taiwanese were not fully represented or not equally represented in politics, although many Taiwanese became KMT members and participated in local politics through the channels that were afforded to them by the KMT. So even during the era of KMT single party authoritarianism, there were many opportunities for Taiwanese to participate in politics at the grassroots level. And those opportunities actually attracted and recruited many Taiwanese into the KMT. So again, it's complicated, it's not a simple story. And then the third thing I want to say about the ROC is that it was a form of Chinese nationalist authoritarianism, which prized unification or recovering the mainland. In the view of the KMT during these decades, the goal was to recapture the mainland China from the People's Republic of China or from communist China, and reestablish the Republic of China as the government in all of mainland China as well as in Taiwan. So that was their priority, and they prioritized that goal over the welfare of Taiwan itself. And here's another one of these kind of paradoxes and complexities of this history. A lot of Taiwanese people benefited enormously from the very policies that the KMT instituted that were aimed at strengthening Taiwan so that it could achieve its destiny as the launching pad for recovering the mainland. So the economic policies that the ROC government implemented in Taiwan were tremendously successful. As we know, this is why Taiwan is as it is today, and why I just finished writing this book, Why the Tiger Leading the Dragon, which the argument of which is that Taiwan is also responsible to a very significant extent for mainland China's economic miracle in the last 30 years. So it was the economic policies that the ROC implemented, combined with the just extraordinary ingenuity and determination and work ethic of Taiwanese people and 49ers as well, that achieved these economic, what is often called Taiwan's economic miracle. So, it wasn't all bad for Taiwanese, but it also wasn't about what's good for Taiwan. It was the motivations for the KMT's policies were, how can we strengthen this place so that it can be the launching pad for our recovering the mainland? So what did the Taiwanese want from the 49ers, or what did they want for themselves, not necessarily as supplicants to the 49ers to get it? They wanted ethnic justice, equality, and respect for all the cultures of Taiwan. I think many Minnan speaking Taiwanese were really talking about their own culture, but over time, I think many in Taiwan have come to understand that it is also important to have a political and social system that is respectful of Hakka and indigenous cultures as well. They also wanted democracy. They wanted to get rid of this single party authoritarianism. And they wanted Taiwan's future, and especially Taiwan's future relationship with the mainland, or with mainland China, to be a topic of democratic deliberation rather than something that was a foregone conclusion already predetermined by the KMT. Things changed, I would argue, on this front in 1995, and especially in 1996, when in 1996, Taiwan held its first direct presidential election. And I think for many Taiwanese, this was the kind of the apex of the democratization process. At long last, we are fully democratic. And one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to talk about Taiwan independence, and we're going to talk about maybe just ending the Chinese part of our history altogether, and to launch ourselves out into a new future, which does not have China as part of it. And what they discovered in 1996 was that there was not just the internal China, the ROC China, that needed to be persuaded if Taiwan was going to go its own way. There was an external China, the People's Republic of China, that also needed to be persuaded. And that task was going to be even more difficult than persuading the ROC. So the 49ers resisted hard the idea of Taiwan independence, but the Chinese Communist Party leadership on the mainland is even more determined to prevent Taiwan from going its own way. So suddenly we have the China outside and the People's Republic of China as a significant factor in Taiwan's internal conversation about itself, its identity, its own future. So the heart of the conflict is the heart of the conflict between Beijing and Taipei. And that is another way, by the way, that I avoid saying China. Sometimes I say Beijing instead of China, because that way I don't have to say a modifier in front of the word China. The heart of the conflict between Taipei and Beijing is what constitutes the modern Chinese nation state. So for the People's Republic of China, Taiwan is part of the PRC by virtue of being part of historic China, ancestral China, cultural China, civilizational China, whatever you want to call it. They know that Taiwan must be part of China because it was part of Qing China, it was part of Ming China, and it's part of the Republic of China, and that makes it Chinese. And if it's part of China, then it must be part of the PRC, because the PRC claims the mantle of unmodified China. in the modern world. And it maintains that any territory that was claimed by the Qing at the height of its empire, except for all the places the PRC has actually decided it doesn't want and has quietly let go of over the decades, any territory that was claimed by the Qing at the height of its powers is part of China and is therefore part of the PRC today. So, in other words, the PRC uses historical determinism to define China. And this is fundamentally an ethno-national understanding of the nation state. In Taiwan, on this question, there is no consensus. Taiwan is always complicated, except that nearly everyone rejects the PRC's position. There are a handful of people, and you will see them if you visit Taipei 101, because they wave the PRC flag around down there and yell at tourists. But there aren't very many of them who actually accept the PRC's position. For stalwarts of the Republic of China, historical determinism and ethno-nationalism make sense. But for them, China is still the ROC, and unification under the ROC flag is still the goal. So they advocate unification, but not under the PRC flag. Then there are some independence stalwarts who have agreed China is the PRC and you can have it. But you cannot make Taiwan subjugate itself to your version of what China is. So some deep green, as they're called, Taiwan independence advocates don't reject historical determinism. Instead, they have their own concept of ethno-nationalism that understands Taiwan as ethnically distinct from all forms of China. But for the broad middle and majority of Taiwan society, China is a complicated concept. They understand, they are familiar with all these modifiers. It is possible to recognize Taiwan as somehow ancestrally or culturally related to China, but they reject the historical determinism and ethno-nationalism in favor of a concept of nationhood that is rooted in popular sovereignty or civic nationalism. So for them, the idea of the Republic of China is an okay compromise because it asserts Taiwan's political separation without rejecting its identity as historically and culturally linked to China, and also without provoking the PRC, right, to take some kind of military action to roll back Taiwan's autonomy. So I think this sort of mainstream position that says we can live with the Republic of China as the official designation of our country, even though we understand ourselves to be really mostly about Taiwan and the Republic of China as limited to Taiwan and its outlying islands. In acknowledging the ROC at all, these Taiwanese are rejecting the PRC's claim to represent all of China or to be the sole embodiment of China in the modern world. And so that leads to one last thought that I wanted to explore today, which is the possibility of a future China. Another modifier we might imagine for China is that there could be, in theory, there could be a China in the future that is neither the PRC nor the ROC. And if that were possible, if there were, and this is, somebody came up with this flag, which is Singapore, Macau, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the PRC. The flag for the Chinese language is what they called it. I don't see these, I definitely don't see Singapore joining the club anytime soon. But anyway, under such a concept where it is neither the PRC nor the ROC, but some kind of loose confederation, is it possible for Taiwan to accept such a designation? I don't know. It's very hard to say. The PRC's hard line on basically everything nowadays is alienating Taiwanese more than ever. And I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A if you would like as well. But at the same time, I think we still see that many Taiwanese believe unification is inevitable, that Taiwan cannot maintain itself in this space in between forever, even though they dread the prospect of unification. So perhaps if the PRC were to be less off-putting, such an option might be on the table. Or there's this option, right? The restoration of a Chinese identity for Taiwan, more along the lines of Qing China than the kind of kumbaya future China that the flag for the Chinese language might imagine. So that is what I had prepared to talk about today, and I am very happy to receive your questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Shelley. That was really a kind of a thorough tour of Taiwanese history in relationship to this question of what is China? And I realized I neglected to mention the ROC in my opening comments. I guess that reflects my own biases. The floor is open to everyone. No one had put questions into the chat box. Now, though, if you do have questions, feel free to raise your hands. Maybe to start things off, I have three broad questions, and one is quite historical, the other a bit more contemporary, and the third very topical, Shelley. And people, everyone, seriously do feel free to raise your hands and chime in. One question that I've always had, and we have a grad student here who's working on an aspect of this in her dissertation project, is the kind of historical memory of Japanese colonialism and how different it is in Taiwan, certainly from Korea, but also throughout the rest of Asia, and kind of even the nostalgia that seems to exist in some corners of Taiwanese society for that. And I'm curious what keeps that going, where that's from. Was Japan's hand significantly sort of lighter and it's the way that it governed Taiwan in contrast to some of these other places? Maybe if you could speak about that a bit, especially because it does seem like it maybe gets into a question of the early formation of Taiwanese collective identity as well.
Yes, so this is a great question and one certainly worthy of another dissertation for sure. I want to mention three dimensions. And I need to say them out in advance or I will forget by the time I get to the end of the list. So there's the Japanese colonialism as relative to other Japanese colonial places that you mentioned, also relative to the PRC, and then also relative to the Qing. So what I would say is, first of all, Taiwan was a very frontier place when the Japanese took it over in 1895. State power was not well consolidated there, and there were many parts of the island that were still pretty Wild West. So unlike Korea, which had a long history of, its own dynastic rise and fall and a strong sense of national, what we would call now national identity, of a kind of cultural coherence, at least. Taiwan really didn't have that. So when the Japanese came in, there was a little bit of resistance initially, right? That there were some Taiwanese who said we should have an independent Republic of Taiwan here. But I think the response was maybe more pragmatic and less one of the tragedy of what is being lost here, and more the sort of, oh, here we go again, kind of feeling of handed over from one set of distant rulers to another set of distant rulers. We've never ruled ourselves anyway, and no one's ever really ruled us very, very effectively. So I think there was a little bit of that. And then relative to to Korea, I think it is in fact correct to say that the Japanese colonial government in Taiwan was gentler, maybe a word, or anyway, had a more of a developmentalist objective for Taiwan rather than purely extractive. So there was a great deal of infrastructure that the Japanese built up on Taiwan during the colonial era. They were keen to introduce industry. They were doing a lot of agricultural development and agricultural processing industry. So, they installed the train. In 1906, there was potable water for a couple 100,000 people in Taipei. And when you think about it, that's amazing, right? So, that was kind of the approach. So a lot of people in Taiwan say, the Japanese, they were very harsh. They policed the island strictly, but they were fair, or at least they were predictable. And that leads to the third comparator for Japanese colonial rule, which is what came after. And I think the Japanese era has benefited from the nostalgia created by how negative many Taiwanese have felt and still do feel toward what they might characterize as the KMT colonial arrival after World War II. So it's really hard to know, what would it mean to have an objective assessment of Japanese colonial rule? It's really only exists in collective memory in relation to those other three experiences.
Yeah, and I see we have one or two questions, but I'm going to follow up first on this, leading into a second question, especially because this then relates in some ways to C.K. Lee's talk last week, where she was considering Hong Kong in the context of global China and calling it a restive frontier within the project of kind of China emerging on the world stage and all of these various computations. And in that context, there's also a sense of longing or retrospective looking back towards the period under British colonialism. And there too, not as sort of anti-colonial movement against the British, and very few voices of the Hong Kongese included in the discussions that lead to the handover, and clearly in Taiwan, very few voices either in this transition from Japan to the ROC. I guess what I wanted to ask, though, brings it forward a little bit. And you mentioned the idea of kind of a civic identity or civic nationalism as opposed to an ethno-nationalist approach to what is Chinese or what might work in that part of the world. That was a theme also in CK's talk. And I'm curious, maybe just to put some of what you're saying in dialogue with the experiences that Hong Kong has had over the past, well, since 97, and maybe in particular since 2014, the Sunflower Movement, obviously speaking to that early Occupy umbrella, and then more recently, the repercussions of the protests and the clampdown.
Yes, I think civic nationalism is the only option for Taiwan and for Hong Kong, because the PRC has basically made it impossible through the threat and the exercise of coercive force to imagine another, an ethno-national identity for those places. However, I don't think, I don't, obviously the way that ethno-nationalism has been foreclosed is unfortunate. But I don't think ethno-nationalism is necessarily the answer to politics in the future. So the fact that how people are sort of required, if they want to make the case for their home as a country, as a place worthy and deserving of self-government, if they have to make it on the grounds of freedom and democracy, you could do worse. Ethno-nationalism doesn't have a great record in our world. So, and I think Hong Kong is even more, it's just more extreme in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong never had a chance. That once the handover documents were signed, it was part of the PRC, whereas Taiwan is not part of the PRC, has never been part of the PRC, so can still make a claim for a Chinese identity or not a Chinese identity, rooted in a shared experience of self-government over time that begins to take on the gravitas of a modern state.
Thank you, Shelley. Howard, I saw that your hand was raised.
Moving beyond this concept of ethno-nationalism, and I realize it's unfair to ask an historian to predict the future, but do you see anything at all possible along the lines of a British Commonwealth, of sharing some aspects of past heritage, but now acknowledging de facto political independence?
Hello, Howard. It's nice to see you. And I'm not a historian, so I'm a political scientist, therefore totally in the business of predicting the future.
Okay.
Yes. You know, that's the thing, is like, it's really out of favor, totally out of favor, to say, yes, such a possibility might exist. Because right now, I think Taiwan's friends around the world, everywhere, have only, you know, they cannot imagine that there could ever be an acceptable offer, that it could ever be possible to have a genuine negotiation in which an enforceable agreement for a kind of commonwealth or, you know, something like that. However, I don't want to close the door forever on such a possibility, because the alternative is, you know, the two alternatives are that we continue to sort of muddle through and, you know, stumble along in this in-between space, which has been working for 70 years. So, you know, don't knock it. But the alternative to that is for the PRC to impose its version of this story on Taiwan. And what gives me pause is the non-trivial number of Taiwanese who will tell you, the last thing I want to see is unification under the one country, two systems formula. But I think that's sooner or later what we're going to get. So I am in arguing that it may be possible in the future, as the PRC evolves, for Taiwan to be enticed by a better deal. I think I am being more optimistic than those who say they cannot imagine a future for Taiwan other than annexation to the PRC.
Well, the one country, two systems has been somewhat reduced in its persuadability in the last couple of years.
Yeah, definitely for Taiwanese. I mean, Taiwanese never really bought into that. Even the KMT, this is important, I think not everyone realizes, the KMT has never endorsed one country, two systems. They have other formulas that they've, you know, endorsed with the PRC, but not one country, two systems. So Taiwan has never been enthusiastic, but after the spiraling catastrophe in Hong Kong, they are less persuadable, as you say, than ever.
Ambassador Fred Chen once gave a talk at Georgetown where someone asked him this question. He responded in a very Chinese way. He said, well, the system's either right or wrong. And if communism is the best thing, why shouldn't all Chinese enjoy it? And if we think democracy is the best system, why not have everybody democratic? What's this two systems for one country? Makes no sense.
Certainly the NSL legislation from last year raises questions about the credibility of any sort of offer that would be on the table. Amala had a question in the chat earlier asking about kind of the changing political climate in Taiwan over the last 20, 30 years, particularly how dangerous it was to talk about independence previously, and now what sort of response is there to slogans and refrains of that type within the island itself? Is that correct, Amala?
Yeah, so the last people who went to jail for talking about Taiwan independence were, I think, a group of students in the spring of 1991. They had gone to Japan to meet with Su Beng, or Shiming. He was a Taiwanese Japanese historian and a fervent advocate of Taiwan independence. And they came back and they talked about it and they got in trouble. But by the end of that year, so 1991, that was the first full democratic election of the National Assembly, which is an institution that no longer exists. The Zhongxiao Donglu, the big street in front of the train station in downtown Taipei, the median strip was lined with flags from the World United Formosans for Independence. So in just a few months, the prohibition against advocating for or talking about independence had completely evaporated. In 1996, as I mentioned, the DPP nominated a presidential candidate in that first direct presidential election who was an unreconstructed independence advocate, and that was his platform in that election. And he did worse than DPP candidates had done in any of the 3 previous rounds of elections. And I think it was from that moment on, and especially then after the PRC came out with military menacing of Taiwan to ensure that a pro-independence president would not be elected in Taiwan. It was really from that moment forward that the DPP had to kind of downplay its independence platform in order to win elections. So while there are many fervent supporters of independence in the DPP, as a party, it has been finessing this issue ever since, because it's not an issue that wins elections. It's not an issue that gets you thrown in jail anymore, but it's also not the sort of mainstream preference of the society. Perhaps eventually it will be, and it may be that the only reason it's not is the PLA, but the PLA is real. And, people being deterred from doing something that might get them killed seems like a rational response to the exigencies of international politics to me.
Thank you, Shelley. Jay, and then Shushin, and I do see there's a question in the chat as well, but Jay, go right ahead.
Thank you for coming here today. My question was concerning the exchanges between Taiwan with the Qing, the Manchu, and added onto that the Japanese colonial era. With the fact that indigenous people do live in Taiwan, would it be appropriate to say that the ROC is a colonial power in Taiwan today, or would it be more accurate to say that the KMT and the ROC are more of resettlers in the area?
So, I really feel like Taiwan from the 16th century, definitely from the 17th century forward, is a kind of settler colony to begin with, right? The island was not terra nullius. There were people there. And unlike indigenous people in other parts of the world, they were not obliterated by Chinese settlers, but their way of life was greatly altered. Their economies, their everything about their way of living, and so I think we can usefully apply the concept of settler colonialism from the very beginning. But Taiwan is also repeatedly recolonized by Dutch and Spanish sailors, military soldiers, who imagined that maybe they could get a foothold on this island that would allow them to operate in Northeast and Southeast Asia. They didn't last long, but they were there long enough to leave physical traces and to very much influence how Taiwanese today understand their own history. And then you have a kind of classic colonialism or colonization by the Japanese, not settler colonization, but more the kind of, sending administrators and not industrialists, sort of state-linked industrialists to Taiwan to mobilize the local population to do tasks on behalf of the metropole. And then, the KMT is, many people in Taiwan would also claim, is a kind of semi-settler colonialism, because they brought a lot of people with them, but they also took over the elite of society and took over the state and were primarily engaged in running the state and trying to facilitate the economy using the labor of Taiwanese people. So, there's a huge conversation among historians and others about exactly how to understand this history. But your characterization of it as a sort of series of waves of colonization is certainly an approach that a lot of people in Taiwan embrace.
Excellent. We'll turn to Shushen. We've also almost made it to the hour mark without mentioning Cornell's role in all of this turmoil going back to 1995. So I'll just leave that aside for now, but hand things to Shushen for your question. There's a couple more questions in the chat, and I see Maggie, you have your hand up as well.
Thank you, Alan. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you, Shelley, here, even virtually. Welcome to our lecture series. It's a great talk, so I fully enjoyed it. Particularly, I really appreciate all the nuances in your presentation about this really complicated, paradoxical processes, which remain very dynamic. I just want to perhaps quickly respond to one point you made about the during the Qing, the state was not consolidated in Taiwan, and which actually is the start of this modern nation state building. The two sides of the Taiwan Strait actually experience very different or divergent dynamics or processes. And then I have a question about particularly the US as a key external factor in the continued drama here. About the first, actually, one of my kind of ancestors from my father's side was appointed as the high-ranking official in Fujian province in charge of the salt management. I recently just came across some historical documents. He wrote actually to the emperor about Taiwan. They basically manage, the local affairs from distance, from Fujian instead of, on island. Actually, most of those memos or reports talk about the local disturbances, some security incidents, or the necessary assistance when there's natural disaster or whatever. So also those actually speak to what you said. Before Japan took over Taiwan as a colony, Taiwan was not really consolidated as other part of China or Qing China. So my question about also actually when you talk about the 49 years, also from the same family, actually my father's, my grandmother, or myself, her sister, the whole family, because her husband was the Air Force officer of, KMT, and then they flew to Taiwan along with Chiang Kai-shek. So we have this kind of family relationship as well. But again, this also what you very beautifully kind of presented. I hope, just many of America, China scholars will have such expertise when it comes to Taiwan. But my question really about, giving the rise of China, giving the emerging so-called strategic competition between US and China, despite China's resistance to labeling this relationship as competitive, this factor will continue to play into the future of Taiwan or status of Taiwan. Particularly in a year or so, there are a lot of, as we see, coverage of Taiwan story, basically defining Taiwan as the most dangerous place in the world. So I think US has been always part of the game, but here, giving the much higher stake in this most important bilateral relationship. And even recently, I think the naval minister talked about
there is
just in 1 minute, I'll
okay, but
talk about, no matter peacefully or not, the unification won't be in US interest. So I just want to hear your insight, whatever you think will be great. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I love the story about your ancestor and writing memos about disturbances in Taiwan from Fujian. That's a fantastic little anecdote. I think the US needs to do some thinking about your question. I worry. People always ask me, aren't you nervous about Taiwan and China? Taiwan, bad things happening, crazy people in Taiwan gonna, start a war. China, so belligerent, gonna start a war. And my answer is always, who makes me nervous? Washington, D.C. makes me nervous. Because there are people in the US, not necessarily in the US administration at this moment, maybe, who cannot separate the interest of Taiwan from the interests of the United States, and for whom Taiwan's role in the world is as some kind of a pawn in a game that the US is playing with the PRC. And I think that is just incredibly dangerous. I think it's dangerous to the US because it can entice people to make a big mistake and assume that Beijing is a paper tiger or not genuinely committed to this course of action. But it's really dangerous to Taiwan. Any military confrontation that happens will result in death and suffering of Taiwanese civilians. And it's really important to me that US policymakers have that reality in mind when they talk about Taiwan as, for example, a strategic asset for US geopolitical competition with PRC. I really hate that kind of language because I think it is, it's just reducing Taiwan to a means to an end rather than as an end in itself.
Yeah, I think there are smaller actors around the globe who've had the same treatment over the years. That though actually leads quite nicely into a question which Mark had put in the chat. It was using the kind of, is the US part of Taiwan, but particularly I think thinking of political economy, the political economy between the two places, and Foxconn's involvement with Wisconsin, and maybe like Taiwan's presence in the American economy and the role that plays.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So, Taiwan is not only an important democracy and a kind of exemplar of the success, for once, of US Cold War policy, global policymaking. It is also a huge economic player. And there was a period of time where we used to say, why why is the PRC so determined to, get Taiwan back, was how people said it, even though Taiwan has actually never been part of the PRC, but, we understand what that means. And part of the answer for a while was, well, Taiwan has such a great economy and, the PRC could benefit from that. Well, then Taiwan kind of took its economy voluntarily to the PRC and enabled the PRC to become this export manufacturing powerhouse globally, and to the point where it no longer really needs Taiwan for many things, although it definitely does need Taiwan for semiconductors, as do we all. But now Taiwan's economic role has moved into a new phase somehow, where I hear people in the US making claims to it as if it were ours to take. So I was in a conference a couple of weeks ago where people were very seriously discussing, we should just get TSMC to move their foundries to the US, because this company is too important to the US to leave it in Taiwan. And, this is the same kind of neo-imperialist nonsense that has gotten the US into trouble again and again and again. And so I see the rise of China as an economic and a political, diplomatic, military competitor to the US, driving some really toxic logic in the US, including on the economic front. Actually, I think if TSMC has a business interest in building manufacturing capacity in the US, they'll do it. They will take every business incentive that is offered them, as would any investor. But, it's the US's job to persuade foreign companies to invest in the US. They are not ours to somehow sort of snatch up and steal away.
Excellent. Thank you, Shelley. Maggie, I think, and then I see you, Keenan, too, and there's another question in the chat, but I'll first hand things over to Maggie.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. My question has to do with social movements and democracy in Taiwan. And in particular, my question is, given Taiwan's unique sense of historical identity and the emergence of a strong civic nationalism in recent decades, to what extent has these factors impacted the success of liberal social movements in Taiwan? And in particular, I guess I'm thinking of the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2019 and how Taiwan sort of earned international reputation as the first in Asia to do so, in contrast to other democracies like South Korea and Japan.
Yes, what a great topic to bring up. I think sometimes people worry that Taiwan's democracy has made it vulnerable because, somehow we imagine that toughness is limited to kind of militaristic states, and that, the toughest ones are the fascist ones, and the next toughest ones are the communist ones, and the next toughest after that are the kind of personal authoritarians, But I actually think that Taiwan's refusal to play the, or giving up on its effort to be a military dictatorship, which was another way people sometimes characterize the Chiang Kai-shek era, is what has allowed Taiwan to still exist. If Taiwan had not democratized, I am quite confident it would be part of the PRC already, because there was no reason in the 1970s and 80s for the US to risk its relationship with the PRC to continue to defend an increasingly hardline and unmovable dictatorship. And so, I think what saved Taiwan was Jiang Jingguo and under pressure from the society, right? Under pressure from civil society, Jiang Jingguo's decision to go ahead and let democratization happen as a way of reconstituting Taiwan's international value and its value to the US. And then Taiwan has just gone on, like reinforcing that more and more and more with more and more soft power. So if we look at the situation right now with, Czechia and Lithuania and these sort of unexpected outbursts of pro-Taiwan sentiment around the world, they're largely driven by precisely the persona that you're describing, this persona of Taiwan as the place where free people can freely pursue the goals that they have for themselves. And so a lot of them are not sort of hard politics. Taiwanese youth are not very interested in talking about the military. They're not even very interested in talking about economics. They're interested in talking about, the things that make life good. And there is a whole universe of people who say that is childish and you shouldn't do it. But I say, it's, if we can't talk about that, what can we talk about? I'm not ready to decide that the only thing left for us is war and climate change. I want justice now. We may not be able to hold it forever, but why not get it and have it while we can and hold it as long as we can, because it does make us stronger. I really believe that. And it absolutely wins Taiwan friends everywhere to be that sort of beacon still of freedom beyond just democratization, but now going into all these other realms.
Well,
Thank you,
Shelley.
Professor. Very fascinating.
Yes, thanks, Maggie. That was great. Picking up on that, I'm reading an essay right now by the former Sikong of the Tibetan government in exile, where he's talking about the democratization process of Tibetan government and the Dalai Lama's decisions to step down from his political positions. And there's some parallels there. That being said, I think there are deep concerns, obviously, amongst the Tibetans and on Taiwan as well about these processes and where they'll leave people. And that goes directly to a question which Sophia asked, just looking back again at 2019 in Hong Kong and the passage of the NSL last year. Do you think that there's a stronger desire for independence now in Taiwan looking in that direction than there was previously? And how is that continuing to unfold?
Yeah, I think there's support for independence, and then there's opposition to accepting what the PRC is trying to impose on Taiwan, right? So a lot of people start by rejecting the PRC's logic and demands and pressure, and then some of them move into actually supporting independence. So I think that there is some movement into actual support for independence. People who are willing to say, I'm for independence, even though it has all of these risks and dangers associated with it. I think it is being driven a lot by what's happened in Hong Kong. Taiwanese are not overwhelmingly preoccupied with the Hong Kong situation, but they are aware of it and they know that it is negative and that it is kind of reinforcing their skepticism about the Beijing government and what the Beijing government is sort of capable of doing. So they're not exactly surprised or disappointed because they had very low expectations for the PRC government anyway, but they find that skepticism validated. A couple of other things that are driving that negative sentiment too are the military pressure. The military pressure does not make anybody love the PRC. Also COVID. I did some survey research in May with some co-authors who are probably known to some of you, so I'm going to name them: Lev Nachman, Nathan Chan, and John Mock. They were all graduate students at UC Irvine. Now 2 of them have graduated. But anyway, we did this big survey back in May, and one of the things we found is that Taiwanese people totally blame the PRC for COVID. Like, they do not at all buy the idea that, COVID would have been a whole lot worse if the Chinese Communist Party leadership weren't in charge of stopping it before it got out of control. Like that, no. So COVID is driving negative sentiment. Hong Kong is driving negative sentiment. Military pressure is driving negative sentiment. And also Xi Jinping is driving negative sentiment because people in Taiwan are well aware that things are shutting down on the mainland as well. Taiwanese have a lot of front row seats. There are a lot of Taiwanese that are currently in the mainland, and they see this stuff happening. And they talk to people about the ways in which the PRC's political and social and economic climate are darkening.
Excellent. Thank you, Shelley. Keenan, I see you put a question in the chat. Would you rather have me ask it, or do you want to ask yourself? Really, it seems like you're focusing here, Keenan, on it's a great question about, so the KMT being in the opposition right now, but will not always be there, and where you see their kind of position on cross-strait relations and their electoral prospects, quite frankly. They've been down before and come back. Where do things stand, especially as I know that there are some questions about President Tsai's popularity as the pandemic kind of keeps going on and all the rest of it? And Keenan, you feel free to ask a follow-up question. Why don't we start with that?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. The KMT is a mess, right? But I think it's important, as Alan just said, the KMT has been a mess before, and it has come back. The problem now is, I think, the public opinion has kind of moved beyond the options that the KMT is really prepared to think seriously about internally. So it's like 92 consensus or not 92 consensus. Well, 92 consensus is just a non-starter in Taiwan's domestic politics. So you've got to come up with something else. And that is proving very difficult. So on the one hand, I'm not very optimistic about the KMT, but on the other hand, I made the mistake of declaring the KMT dead in 2001, and that was a mistake. So I'm not doing that again. And I think why I am not doing that again is not just that I don't want to make the same mistake twice, but also that there are other issues besides cross-strait relations. And I do think that the KMT has some space, especially on domestic issues, to appeal to the voters. That's what happened in 2018 with local elections and the rise of Han Kuo-yu. And obviously Han Kuo-yu was the wrong guy, as it turns out, the wrong guy, or maybe the right guy, but definitely the wrong time. But, people right now, Donald Trump is running neck and neck in the polls with Joe Biden. Like, seriously, America, you're ready to go back to that right now? So if Americans are ready to go back to Donald Trump, then, it seems entirely possible to me that Taiwanese are going to be ready to go back to the KMT after 8 years of the DPP in power, and after, as is inevitable, the DPP's positions having sort of played out to their logical end. And so what do we do next? If the KMT can focus on domestic policy, they may have some decent options. However, they do have to figure out what is their answer to the question of cross-strait policy. If you look at Ko Wen-je, that's his problem, is he doesn't want to answer that question. And so he's sort of self-marginalizing because he doesn't want to say something that then is going to box him in.
Yeah, I think that picked up on the last part of Keenan's question and maybe just expanding on that a little bit more. In terms of cross-strait relations, how different are the two parties at this point in regards to their basic position? It strikes me as a somewhat casual observer that they've converged quite a bit. Is that accurate?
Yeah, they've converged, and they've been converged for a long time. Like, basically, both of them say, we just want to continue the status quo. We don't want we're not looking for unification and we're not looking for independence. We're just trying to navigate this very narrow space between our continued survival and the PRC's determination to end us. But they have two different approaches to how to do that. And I think it's increasingly now, the sides are firming up a little bit. The PRC's position continues to be the safest and most reliable path to continuing the status quo is to try and continue to cultivate better relations with the PRC, that they will allow us to have this running room for a while longer, as long as we don't give them cause to kind of lose their patience. The DPP, and so that's been the KMT's position for a while, but I think the DPP is increasingly now leaning toward the US. So in the past, the DPP would have said, we can do this on our own. We don't need to lean so far toward mainland China. The new dimension that I see is the DPP increasingly touting its ability to attract support from Washington. And that makes me nervous because I don't think Washington is necessarily a reliable friend for Taiwan all the time. So I do take some comfort in the fact that Taiwan is also cultivating soft power and better relations with other Western countries and with Japan, so that they're not solely reliant on the US.
So we're just about out of time. I don't see, Andy just asked a question. Let's see. Andy, do you want to, so Shelley, can you see that in the chat?
Yeah. Well, this is the test this is sort of what Hong Kong is going to teach us, maybe, is it possible to preserve that identity in a unified, a politically, in a place that is dominated by the PRC. The Hong Kong government was hostile to many of the things that Hong Kong people, especially young people, valued for a long time. But they were, they allowed, there was enough freedom for people to go on building their identity, despite the fact that it wasn't, they weren't getting any leadership or support from the top. The question is, how determined is the PRC to stamp out Hong Kong identity? So I think it is probably pretty determined, at least for now. I think it would be equally determined in Taiwan, but it would just be a much larger challenge because there are more Taiwanese people. They are not being led by people who have sort of already accepted Beijing's general view of things. I think it's fair to say that prior to 2019, the political elite in Hong Kong and the business elite were pretty well identified with Beijing and its positions. And over the course of the years of protest, the sort of what constitutes the armed forces in Hong Kong, that is the Hong Kong police force, also became identified with Beijing's objectives because of the crappy way that Hong Kong leaders handled a political crisis. Taiwan is very different, right? Taiwan has a military, like a full-on, honest-to-God 21st century military that is totally not aligned with Beijing's objectives. Its political leaders, whatever party you're talking about, that has any political support at all, are not aligned with Beijing's position. And its business community also is not really aligned with Beijing's objectives, even though there's probably more sympathy for a softer position toward cross-strait relations among business community than non kind of ordinary working class or professional class Taiwanese. So it's just a much bigger undertaking to try to stamp out Taiwanese identity. I don't know if Beijing can afford another Xinjiang after the first one. I mean, it's kind of incredible how much resources they will invest actually in stamping out an unwelcome identity. So I'm not saying they wouldn't try, but I also think it remains to be seen whether it's actually possible.
So we just have a minute or two left. Two final questions. One somewhat ridiculous, and the other more profound, or at least more important. One, so was it a highlight of your career to have John Oliver show your book on his show? And then second, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried should we be about Taiwan today?
So yes, of course, it was a highlight of my career. Because so many people sent me messages about it. You know, I can't stay up that late, so I didn't see it myself, and I never would have known about it except that a friend in Boston said, did you see that? But it's really interesting, you know, the things that qualify as scholarly achievement for us at this moment, having your book flashed on TV during a comedy sketch or a comedy routine. And by the way, I thought John Oliver's, whatever we call that, his report was fantastic. And I couldn't believe how much I wanted to just like call him up and tell him that, although you can't call John Oliver. His phone is unlisted because of how he ended, which was Taiwan does not belong to China and it does not belong to the US. And it belongs to itself. It belongs to its own people, and we need to respect that. So love you, John Oliver. Thank you for being the one person in all of these months of Taiwan as a front page story, the first person that I have heard say, it is not up to us to decide Taiwan's future. So yes. And then the other thing that makes you famous nowadays is, if you're a political scientist, is getting in something called the monkey cage, which is this Washington Post blog where political scientists translate their academic work for a broad audience. And it's just funny, you know, comedy shows and something called monkey cage. This is, you know, the historians will look back at our CVs and say, what the heck was that stuff? And then on the scale of 1 to 10, how worried should we be? I really do not think Beijing is preparing an invasion of Taiwan right now. I think they are legit worried, scared to death that Taiwan is going to bust a move and they're going to have to do something militarily. So I think this is deterrent. I think it is aimed at backing down Tai, and it's definitely aimed at sobering up the US so that we don't make a mistake. Because I don't think they're ready. Nobody wants to be dragged into war. You go to war when you on your own schedule. But if Taiwan made a move that they could not spin as other than a declaration of independence, they'd have to respond militarily. So I don't think they want to have to do that. And so I think what we see now is preparation for the moment when they might have to do that. So, you know, these flights into Taiwan's ADIZ, Tianxia magazine suggested that is really about mapping the ocean floor for submarine warfare, as much as it is in, you know, the psychological warfare aspect of it is just like a happy coincidence. But I don't think it's, you know, I'm not sweating right now.
Good. Well, that's a good way to end then. Thank you very much, Shelley. That was really informative and wonderful. Thank you everyone for attending both today's lecture and the series.
Thanks very much. It was really fun to talk with you, and I hope to see you in real life soon.